Hello, welcome to our 8th week, the last week of this particular course on marketing management part 1. Last week we discussed about segmentation, we discussed about targeting. What we are going to discuss this week first will be how to take the next step in this segmentation targeting leading to a marketing strategy and how to implement that strategy will be the main topic. The details of implementation will be the main topic of our next part, that is marketing management 2 and 3. But now briefly during this week, to start with, I will discuss about the implementation issues that arise from segmentation and targeting, which we call positioning or developing the value proposition or matching the customer segment with what that segment wants expressed through the product and service attributes and so on. One point should be made clear at this stage, that as this particular view graph shows, that marketing strategy arising out of the market segmentation is actually a subset of corporate strategy, the market strategy, and then the segmentation based positioning strategy. So, for example, at the business level, strategy will be that we want to be in the business of home appliances. Out of many different types of consumer durables or consumer asset oriented business possibilities, we have decided to focus on home appliances like refrigerators or like washing machines or like say microwave ovens or cooking range and so on. Out of all that, so this air conditioner, washing machine, dryers, dishwashers, refrigerators, this is the consideration at the business level. The next level comes we decide that okay, we want to be in refrigerators, but then refrigerator itself has different types of market segments. There is a segment for consumer first time home buyer. There is a business for refrigerator which is replacement of some old refrigerator. There is a refrigerator market for institutional clients like hotels or hospitals or hostels and so on. So, if we decide to focus on domestic first time refrigerator buyer, if we want to focus on the replacement market for refrigerators, that means an refrigerator which is 10 years old being replaced by the new model, then that is our segmentation strategy. Coming out of the business strategy, market strategy, we come to the segmentation strategy. So, in a way we move from this left to right, and so once we have decided that this is the customer segment we want to serve, the first time refrigerator buyer or the first time refrigerator replacer, then we have to decide how we are going to position our business to match with the buying characteristics and buying priorities of those customers. As you can easily see, therefore, that this is also dependent on geographical variation. So, for example, the refrigerator buyer in Europe may be different from in characteristics from the refrigerator buyer in China or in India. Similarly, there are also imperatives of the firm, that means what is the priority, as we discussed. For example, a particular company may have priority with respect to cash flow, particular with respect to profitability, with respect to sales volume or revenue generation and so on. By combining those internal priorities and for combining with the characteristics of the market segment we want to address, we will actually come up with the package of different attributes of the product and service bundle, which will try to match as far as possible with the priority requirements of that particular market segment. So, therefore, this positioning or value proposition development tries to balance between among product features, company requirements and customer requirements. Accordingly, you deploy your resources, you go for execution of your market strategy. So, the key point therefore is that the marketing strategy based on segmentation is fundamentally a differentiation based strategy, which allows us to focus our resources in those particular areas which will give us a distinctive position or unique selling position in the marketplace. So, this diagram kind of represents that I can divide the market in many different ways, and I can finally get these as the major segments. Some segments may be overlapping or adjacent, some segments may be completely away from each other, and then the shaded part sort of represents the three different types of market segments which we will like to address. So, this is the first segmentation, and from that making a choice of which segments, and then we can try to develop this particular diagram which shows us that what are our performance objectives at a company level, strategic, operational, then what are our strategic focus in terms of market results like unit sales volume, margins, return on investment and so on. This is interactive and leads us to positioning. So, that means we know which customers we are going to target, what kind of competition will come in our way, therefore, our target competition, the value proposition which will allow us to battle with that competitive positions, and the reason, the main reasons why customer will prefer us, customer will believe us. So, this kind of leads us finally to the development of the marketing mix and other different functional programs that will be working along with marketing like finance or operations and distribution. We will go into much more detail of these parts in the next course, but right now we are actually focusing today on the interaction of these three, 1, 2, 3, the block. Let us I would like to point out, and maybe tomorrow or day after I will have a little bit more detailed discussion about this positioning aspect, also its interrelation with this product life cycle. So, usually at this stage, the growth stage, obviously the priority is growth. So, the positioning strategy will be growth oriented, whereas at this stage positioning strategy will be cash flow oriented or with retention oriented, with relationship oriented, with micro segmentation oriented and so on. Whereas in the middle part where there is growth along with profit, we would like to maximize our footprint. So, accordingly one can create this sort of a chart. As you see here, this is just different stages in the life cycle and the different kind of priorities that come up and the typical figures that we will see. This is done from a a huge study that was done across many industries over a long span of time in Europe and as well as America. So, that shows that for example, at the startup stage sales growth, 74% sales growth sort of accent is normal, whereas in the late maturity stage that will come down to something like 6%, or the market share objective at the startup stage will be 8%, whereas at the late maturity stage could be 24%, if in the early maturity stage a company has been able to achieve the 24-25% dominant position. Similarly, the R&D to sales ratio, the marketing to sales ratio, those budget levels change as you go across from startup to late maturity stage. And there are these financial performances that also keep changing. The financial performances keep changing as you grow from the left to right, from startup to the late maturity stage. And you can see that the priorities with respect to cash flow or investment growth, etc., change also across the life cycle. So, as a result, your positioning, segmentation, target positioning, that package must also lead to this kind of statement, that increase our primary market share from 18% to 21%, while holding to our margin on sales at the current 20% level. So, this is a kind of a typical, very crisp, clear strategic statement that will come out from the STP exercise, and that will help us to understand that what are the different priorities in this diagram that we will go for, or what kind of resource allocation we will go for. So, market segment strategy gives us a strategic focus. It helps us to put together the package of attributes expressed through sales and service offerings, positioning, and it also gives us the clues towards the implementation program. And there will be some trade-offs sometimes between growth and market share, or profitability and cash flow, but one does not mean that it will be either or, but there will be some change in the mix of accent or focus. So, there may be sometimes we are never going to go for zero cash flow and very high profitability. It is an absurd situation, but sometimes we may give profitability the preference over cash flow, or cash flow the preference over profitability. As we showed in the life cycle diagram, that is kind of determined by where we are or where that particular industry is or that market is. Operational objectives will come out of these strategic objectives, will result into specific numbers and statements like this, that from 81% to 18% to 21% market share increase, or while we hold the current level of 20% margin, and so on. So, you see, then once we have this profit, ROI, market share, growth, margin, etc., determined from the discussion which is based on our STP, from the understanding the segment, the size, the growth rate of the segment, and how well we match the requirement of that segment with respect to the competition, etc., then we can, this kind of a very clear cut diagram, that our superordinate goal or the top goal, strategic goal, is to improve profit and ROI, and that we are going to achieve through emphasis on increase in unit sales volume, as well as improving margins and return on investment. And you can see, therefore, we create emphasis on new revenue as well as create emphasis on reduce costs and assets. So, therefore, the strategic goals that emerge from the STP exercise will often be multidimensional. Sometimes they may appear to be relative conflict with each other, but we often have to balance these conflicting requirements or trade-offs through different types of combinations, because the business may need cost reduction as well as achievement of new revenues. So, one has to creatively think. It may lead to some new models, it may lead to some deep mining of certain types of market segments and so on. That will become clear through different types of examples. So, if we are wanting to now come into say for example, an entry level hatchback car, we know that we are going to be against formidable competition from Maruti or from different other player in that segment like Hyundai, etc. And if we want to be a player in that market, then against their sales level at million units, we will have to do an uphill movement, and therefore there our market growth achievement will be slower. So, there may not be much of a point there, reduce margin. So, one has to therefore come up with the right kind of cost and see if one can at the ruling price level, at the competition determined price level, if one can generate higher margin to create higher leverage or strategic kitty, by virtue of which one can do more advertising, more promotion, more different kinds of penetration activities, so that the market expands. On the other hand, if one is going to focus on say the designer car, where actually there are companies who take a normal chassis from Maruti or Tatas or Fiat or whatever, and they create a completely beautiful super luxury body of a car that looks different, feels different, operates different, even though the chassis, the engine, etc. may be the same, but they make some significant improvements and thereby create a high attraction for a particular kind of luxury or collector buyer. Now, in this kind of a market, one can have obviously a different sort of strategic objective of balancing price, margin, etc. So, this may be this possibly could be a segment that will yield high price as well as high margin, but obviously it became very narrow and specific segment. It will be it will lead to maybe lower number of units, but higher price per unit sort of combination. Therefore, what if one looks at that objective is to increase unit sales, then you can either do it through increasing customer retention or increase the customers frequency of usage. This kind of strategy we apply in toothpaste, etc. We can try to take some customers away from the competition, which is normally very tough when the market is in a stable state, or we can try to open up complete new business areas, like say penetrate the rural market for toothpaste and so on. And similarly, there can be ways to improve margin and investment, return on investment, by raising prices, tough, improve the sales mix possible, reduce operating cost, normally the top focus area, or improve asset utilization, also well practiced focus area. So, you can see the importance of positioning from this animated chart, that the customer is here and the customer is bombarded with messages from competitor A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and therefore, you can see here the question, if you are coming into this market, like we were discussing just now about entering into the hatchback entry level car market, then the customer obviously will like to know why you. I already have all these options, what is it that you bring to the table? You see, that is where this value proposition come into the picture, and you have to come up with some value, whether it is the automatic transmission at that price level, or some kind of safety feature, or some kind of increased warranty feature, or some kind of additional facilities inside the car, and so on. You have to come up with the kind of extras, kind of emphasis which will be appealing as a value proposition to this customer who is here. And you can immediately see, therefore, there will be different shades of customers here, different segments, sub segments of customers here as first time buyer of the entry level car, and your value proposition design will change accordingly. Therefore, you can see in this chart, for example, if you are trying to introduce a soft drink, a beverage which is lime and lemony, will be competing against 7-Up, and then this is the way we will make our positioning statement. And if this is the statement for positioning, then accordingly our market opportunities are kind of recognized in this fashion, and what we are telling the customer also changes in a way, the way we are positioning. So, if we say that 7-Up tastes better than Sprite, then we are telling the customer compare, and you will see that we do better. Or if we see, if we do not want to go into that kind of head up, head to head competition, we may say 7-Up, the real thing, the only one. So, we are claiming that therefore, this is unique, and therefore, we have to create something to say, convey that particular, when the customer actually experiences 7-Up, the customer should see that there is a match between what we are saying here and what we are delivering. This is very important, because if we make a claim which is not depicted by the product, not delivered by the product or service or product service bundle, then obviously we are going to create a post consumption dissonance, and that is a major source for failure. So, to conclude, the positioning in the market segment means that you have consumers, end users, intermediaries, selected market segment. Your positioning has to address all of them. Your positioning also will depend on various kinds of other service, other functions within the company, like the supply chain, the delivery chain, the distribution. It will be interacting with the direct competitors, indirect competitors. All of these forces and all of these different types of entities, and these entities, the interaction creates the position. So, position, therefore, a positioning statement or a position based strategy must look at all these as factors to create the design of the value proposition, and the design of the value proposition is therefore kind of almost synonymous with the concept of positioning, and the design of the value proposition contains functional values, psychological values, economic values. So, we say usually cognitive or logical part to the value proposition, and affective or emotional part to the value proposition, because we know that in segmentation similarly we have used demographic and other kinds of fact based logical segmentation, as well as psychographic and other kinds of emotion or cultural or geographic segmentation. So, therefore, when we are creating the value proposition, it must match that sort of segmentation. So, this in a way, this particular diagram represents what we have been trying to say in this session, that there are a number of issues that will have to be looked at, internal factors as well as external factors, to create the positioning target. And once that segment for whom we are positioning our product and service bundle are identified, then they are matched by proposing a bundle of values which are logical as well as emotional, functional as well as utilitarian, economic as well as cultural and geographic specific. So, this is in a way the summary of STP as a very important part of the marketing management activity. Thank you.